plot twist in horror will often be the thing that many people remember most about the thing that they just watched, but whenever it comes to this episode of The Twilight Zone,
it's time enough at last.
It's clear that this one has stuck out to many of us far more than most.
Everybody's dead except me.
But the question we're looking to answer in this series is not if this is a good twist, but if this is the best twist in all of horror. And there's not much that is more horrifying than what happens to Mr. Henry Bemis whenever he finally has the time to do the one thing that he has been wanting to do his entire life.
I'm sure I'll be forgiven for this.
But before we go with him to the Twilight Zone, we first have to visit him at the bank, where the episode starts and we actually pan over to see Mr. Henry Bemis counting some change back to a woman standing in front of his window. And the first thing that really stands out to us are his super thick glasses that he has. But luckily it's not a worry about if he can see what he's doing. It's whether or not he's paying attention to what he's doing, as he looks over to Miss Chester and starts to ask her if she's ever read David Copperfield.
How's that?
He just starts to explain some of the plot of the story, just jumping directly into probably where he was in the story of explaining that David's new stepfather is called
Murdstone. Isn't that a villainous name?
And not just leaving it there to go back to explain everything else that's happened in David's life, but immediately jumping over to explain that Murdstone's sister is...
Mr. Bemis, you've shortchanged me again.
Because Miss Chester here is clearly not paying attention to anything that he's actually saying, but instead has just been counting her money because she's ready to go about her day. But it's interesting to me because she specifically says, "You've shortchanged me again," letting us know that this is not the first time this has happened. And I just love his response as he's like looking down at his book, waiting for her to finish whatever she's saying, as he finally looks up and it clicks with him. Oh no, I messed up. But what I love even more is the fact that he almost calls her Miss Murdstone.
Terribly sorry, Mrs. Chester.
Luckily catches himself just before he refers to her as a villainous name. He then apologizes to her and reaches over and grabs another dollar and hands it to her. Immediately then just telling her more about the book that she clearly doesn't care about. It's very clear that she doesn't care about this book as she grabs all of her stuff, gives him a, and then just walks away. But Henry doesn't even notice because he's too busy looking at the book and explaining. He even looks up and then back down at the book when he looks back up again and finally realizes, oh, she left. Then he does something that he obviously couldn't do as he grabs his little "next window please" sign and sticks it up there so he can continue his reading. It's when he's getting more and more lost in the book that we see a shadow pass by behind him, letting us know somebody's standing over his shoulder watching him not do his job. And it's not just someone, it's actually Henry's boss, Mr. Carlsville. And clearly frightened, Henry kind of stumbles up out of his chair and looks at Mr. Carlsville and asks him,
I don't suppose you've ever read David Copperfield, have you?
I guess just rolling the dice, hoping that he's also a fellow book lover, but instead he tells him, no, I haven't. Can you please come with me to my office? Which is never a good sign, as he then walks away and Mr. Henry Bemis has to follow. And it's here when we get Rod Serling's opening narration to explain to us what is fixing to happen and how Mr. Henry Bemis is going to make his way into the Twilight Zone. And it's all going to happen because Mr. Henry Bemis is
a bookish little man whose passion is the printed page.
But the problem that has already been established at the very beginning of the episode is that every single person in his life does not share his passion. But his real enemy above all is
the unrelenting hands of a clock.
But in just a moment, all of that is going to change because
he'll have a world all to himself, without anyone.
Making it clear right away that this is not the twist of the episode. Instead, this is just what is going to play out, is that he is going to be all alone, which is a lot like the last episode, but it's a lot different. Everything here happens way different.
Well, literally, there hasn't been a soul.
But what is not too different is Burgess Meredith being in a Twilight Zone episode. because this is just the first of 4 episodes that Burgess actually appeared in as the leading actor, putting him tied for first place with Jack Klugman for an actor in the leading role the most amount of times in the Twilight Zone. Some good episodes right up in here, so if you're looking for something to go and watch, here's all the suggestions you need. Where we pick back up is in the president of the bank's office, who is Mr. Carlsville, and he is telling Mr. Henry Bemis that he
do not function within the organization
as he should, and going as far as to tell him that he is not a good bank teller, he is not a good employee, but instead is a reader.
A reader?
a reader.
Mr. Carlsville clearly doesn't pull any punches as he is telling him exactly how he feels about Mr. Bemis here. Which, I get it, you know, if your employee is not doing what you're paying them to do and is causing more work for everybody else because all he wants to do is read, that's one thing. But when he calls him out saying, I even see you go into the bank vault and read on your lunch break, it's like, okay, it's his lunch break. Who cares? Mr. Carlsville, that's who, because he gives him an ultimatum: either do your job and stop reading while you're here, or you will find yourself out on a park bench with all the time in the world to read whenever you want. And he leaves him with the, do I make myself clear? When Henry just looks at him and says, yeah, you do, but it's just that...
Just that what, Bemis? Make it quick and get back to your cage.
Cage? Jeez, Guy, what do you mean cage? There's clearly so much wrong with that, but I'll just chalk it up to Rod Serling doing a really good job of making us not like the president of this bank. And this is actually Rod Serling's favorite episode out of the 92 that he wrote for the Twilight Zone, which I guess I should clarify because I'm sure somebody will bring it up. But he actually took a short story written by Lynn Venable of the same title and then rewrote it to fit for television. And this is when Henry begins to explain that the reason that he is reading at work is because his wife doesn't let him read at home. And it's not just like her walking and saying, hey, put the book down, talk to me. It's more that if she catches him reading a book, she will physically take the book away. If she finds that he's reading the newspaper, she'll snatch it out of his hands. And with nothing to read, he's even caught himself in the kitchen reading the labels on the condiment bottles. But she even put a stop to that.
Now, she won't even let me use the ketchup.
Which seems pretty intense. And Mr. Carlsville has something to say about his wife.
Your wife is an amazingly bright woman.
It's clear that Henry's thoughts are written all over his face. And maybe, just maybe, they have a point. Because last election season, Mr. Bemis sat around the entire day staring down everybody that walked into the bank to see what their little vote pen had to say so he could figure out exactly who they voted for. Going as far as to stare down a young lady that walked in, making her feel so uncomfortable that she tried to hit him with her umbrella. Instead of just letting it go, Henry tries to clarify again that he was just trying to see who she voted for, also making it clear to his boss that this conversation really didn't get anywhere with him, because he also goes to walk out of the door, stopping just before he makes it out to pick up a newspaper. And I guess to avoid being fired on the spot, Henry puts it back down, makes his way out of the president's office, and finishes out his day at work, where we then pick up that evening in his home as he's sitting in his chair, trying to just read the paper. But Helen's not going to let that slide as she storms into the living room, snatches the paper from him, asking him if he wants some more coffee, where he calmly says no.
Well, then why don't you tell me that? And don't sneak off into the living room
to bury yourself in newsprint. Taking it even a step farther after this by saying that she's not going to have a husband of hers burying himself in reading whenever he could be engaging in conversation. Henry, being the true reader that he is, recognizes that the way she worded her sentence is pretty funny as he laughs and says,
Well, how many husbands have you got? You've only got me.
Because she said a husband and not my husband. But her response to this is just a stab in the heart.
I would appreciate that not being rubbed in.
After making Henry feel terrible, she tells him to go and change his shirt and to get ready because they are to be over at the Phillips house in 15 minutes to play cards that evening. Luckily, this seems to cheer Henry up.
Oh, dear.
Oh, wait, no, sorry, never mind. All he wants to do is stay home, relax, and just read the one thing that he's not allowed to do anywhere. So he tells her that he'll be ready. She walks out of the room, and you can pay attention and notice that she doesn't seem to go very far outside of the door. Sadly, though, Henry doesn't notice as he walks back over to his chair, lifts up the cushion, and finds a book underneath it that he stuffs into his jacket pocket and goes to walk out of the room.
What have you got, Henry?
What have you got, Henry?
Nothing, my dear.
I mean, he tries his hardest to just play it cool, be like, I don't, me? Are you talking to me? I don't know what you're talking about. But it's clear that she already knows exactly what is in his pocket. As she reaches in, she snatches the book, and she begins to hold it, reading the front, saying that it is modern poetry. Walking him over to the couch and asking him more questions, she holds the book up to him and asks him, would you like to read me some?
Do you mean read you out loud out of the book?
And Henry sits down, super excited to read his wife some poetry, even explaining who some of the authors are, that there's some beautiful poems in this book. But when he opens it up, he sees that every single page has been crossed out with marker. Standing up, confused, but knowing, he still asks his wife, who did this?
You should thank me, really.
She then calls him silly for reading and even calls the poems doggerel, which I had to look up exactly what that means, and here it is, because this is not how I speak normally. It sounds like she's well read.
I say it's doggerel.
Henry's clearly upset by this as he says, no, there are really some beautiful things in here. And it doesn't matter to Helen as she grabs the book again and begins just ripping pages out and throwing them into the floor. And Henry's just pleading with her to stop as he falls down to the floor. And because you're paying attention, you will notice that his glasses fall from his face whenever he goes to reach down for the papers, giving us just a little bit of very good foreshadowing, and starts to grab up all of the pages as he stands back up and asks her,
Why, Helen? Why do you do these things?
and her response is so cold as she just looks him in the face and says, because I married a fool, and walks out of the room, leaving Henry with the torn pages in his hands, and I'm sure his heart in the same state. Then we pick up at lunchtime the next day at his job as Henry's grabbing all of his stuff and is beginning to make his way to the same spot that he always has his lunch, down in the bank vault, where he can read in peace and not be bothered by anybody in his life. But this time, as he's walking that way, he makes sure to look around to see if anybody is in fact watching him go to his secret hiding spot. Luckily, not seeing anyone, he shuts himself in the vault, walks over, sits down, opens up his lunch, and grabs the newspaper, where we read right on the front of it, H-bomb capable of total destruction, but also that this is the Daily Chronicle, which is published daily. But there's not a date on here, so what day is this from? What year is this from? Is this yesterday's newspaper? Today's? Is it tomorrow's that hasn't yet come out? How should we know? We don't, because this is the Twilight Zone, so it doesn't really matter now, does it? Henry really doesn't seem to be bothered by it anyway, so he just lays the newspaper aside, eats his lunch, and we see the book that he brought in there flip open on its own, as well as this pocket watch that he set aside to be able to track his lunchtime as it shatters 24 minutes into his lunch break. And this is followed by a violent explosion that shakes everything around him. Yes, luckily his glasses are so thick that they don't do what the pocket watch did and just explode on his face. But he's probably thinking that's exactly what happened with all the craziness that's going on around him as he finally falls back into the floor and passes out. Some time passes as Henry finally wakes up and begins to make his way out of the vault, struggling to push the door open and then making his way up the stairs where there is total destruction all around him. And clearly being in a daze from whatever is going on, he goes to sit in a chair just to sort of take everything in when he's startled back to his feet by a voice just right next to him.
I can only tell you that in adherence to duty.
where he looks over the desk that is in front of him to see that somebody is crushed under all of this debris and that it was a recorder playing back its final message as it then also explodes.
Could you type that up in triplicate?
Okay, explodes is a bit intense for what actually happened. And as you'll notice throughout the rest of the episode, this is the only body that he finds, and I'm not sure if it's like a rating thing or if they're trying to imply that the blast was so intense that if you weren't covered by some sort of rubble, you were evaporated on the spot, which would make me ask the question of why is there some of the stuff that he finds later in the episode still there? Henry then stumbles backwards and then wanders his way into the lobby of the bank, seeing nothing left, as he then also makes his way out of the bank to see that it is no better outside. Because as far as he can see, it is nothing but a wasteland that is left of his hometown. And it's here where we get a very rare mid-episode narration from Rod Serling, as he looks and finds nothing. The neighborhood bar is gone, the movie theater is destroyed, the baseball diamond, the hardware store, and even
The mailbox of what was once his house and is now a rubble.
And it's here that we hear his first words after all of this has happened, standing just outside of the crater of what was once his home.
Helen! Where are you?
And we get another line from Serling telling us just how long he has been out here looking for anyone.
Henry Bemis on an 8-hour tour of a graveyard.
8 hours that he has been out here just trying to figure out what happened and where everyone is, as it finally hits him.
Everybody's dead except me.
And wrestling with this conclusion, it also hits him. The reason that he's okay is because he was down in the bank vault when everything happened. But now the real question is, does he even want to be alive?
I'm not at all sure that I want to be alive.
Truly thinking on the answer to that question, he makes his way over to the grocery store where he finds a bunch of food. Food long enough to last him years and years on end, so at least he doesn't have to worry about starving. Now, here's another issue with the Twilight Zone being as old as it is, because they were still studying the effects of nuclear fallout at the time, because he wouldn't be able to eat any of this food.
All the food I can eat.
Everything here is basically already radioactive, including himself, because according to Fallout procedure, he should have stayed within the vault for at least 2 weeks. But he definitely didn't know that at the time, and neither did literally anybody else. Grabbing a potentially poisonous cookie? I'm not really sure what he's eating here. He then sets off with a cigarette in hand over to a couch where he can just take a nap and I guess hope that this is all just a dream. But before closing his eyes, he says the worst part of all of this is
Being alone.
which does go right along with the last episode, but it's not just the being alone, it's the fact that he doesn't have anything to do. He's just going to be eating, smoking cigarettes, and reading the same half of a newspaper. Sadly waking up in the same destruction that he went to sleep in, he wakes up to see a vehicle not far off. And if you need proof that this is a horror show, it's right here whenever the car doesn't start. And this pushes Henry over the edge as he jumps out of the car, slams the door, and begins just yelling for anybody to come and help him.
Someone there? Please, someone!
But his only answer is the silence of death. He quickly calms himself down from this and rationally begins to walk his way through everything that's going on around him, reminding himself that he has enough food and that he's thankful to be alive.
Help! Help! Someone, please!
Obviously, that doesn't seem to last but for a few seconds as he begins screaming through what is left of the town and stumbles his way into what is left of the sporting goods store and directly into a case full of guns. Here he picks up a revolver and is quietly talking to himself about the loneliness and all of the sameness.
If there was just something to do.
And we know exactly what is fixing to happen as he's telling himself that surely he will be forgiven for what he's fixing to do.
I know I'll be forgive it.
And it's just then, as he's putting the revolver up to his temple, that he sees the public library, as he stops himself and even drops the gun to make his way over to it. And running up the steps, finally having some excitement, he sees the collective works of Dickens and George Bernard Shaw, as well as many, many more books for him to read.
Books! All the books I'll need.
All the books that he could ever want to read. As he begins to grab them, he starts to stack them up in piles all up and down the staircase, so that way he can know this is good for January, this is good for February, this is good for March.
The next year, and the year after.
Books and books for years on end. The only thing that he's ever wanted, and the only thing that it cost him, was every single person that he ever knew. But in this moment, the absolute best part to him
Is there's time now.
all the time that he could ever want, all the time that he would ever need to finally do the one thing that he's always wanted to do: read.
There's time enough at last.
Sitting down now and rejoicing in all the time that he now has, he reaches for his first book. As his glasses slip from his face and shatter on the ground, and we see for just a moment what it looks like through his eyes in the blurry vision as he's looking for his now broken glasses. Fumbling around for just a moment, he finally grabs them and picks them up as the lenses are no longer in them, and he says exactly what all of us are also thinking.
That's not fair. That's not fair at all.
He had time now. He had all the time that he could ever need, and it no longer matters. As he stands to his feet and begins to sob, just repeating that it's not fair.
That's not fair.
And we hear again from Serling his final words of the episode. The best laid plans of mice and men, and Henry Bemis.
The small man in the glasses who wanted nothing but time.
Henry Bemis, now just a part of the smashed landscape.
Just a piece of the rubble.
Just a fragment of what man has deeded to himself. Mr. Henry Bemis.
In the Twilight Zone.
It's definitely one of the more depressing twists that I can think of, but we still have to answer the question, is this the greatest twist in all of horror? And out of our 5 points, of course, we have to start with story, and how well does the twist serve the story? And the deeper side of the story is of a man who wanted to spend some time doing the thing that he loved most, even though everybody around him was trying their hardest to keep him from his passion.
Because I'm married to a fool.
And the only reason that he's able to fully pursue his passion is because there is nobody left to stand in his way. So it's not so much of him having this pure joy of finally being able to read, but it's that this is all that he has left. So he's now just clinging on to his final distraction so he doesn't actually have to confront all of the death and destruction that is around him, just for it all to slip away in an instant, leaving him completely stuck in the moment and just becoming another piece of the rubble, as there's nothing else for him to do but fully confront the tragedy. And this is the definition of losing everything that you ever had, but gaining the one thing that you've always wanted, and still asking the question, was it worth it?
I'm not at all sure.
And leaving me to score this category with a 94. And for our second category, we have acting, and asking the question, how well does the actor pull off the scene? And first, I have to point out that Burgess Meredith here is fantastic throughout the entire episode. Between being lost in thought and just thinking about his passion, to clearly being upset by what people are saying directly to him, with standout scenes like this.
Help! Help! Someone, please!
And the incredible way that he handles the ending here, because it's not with rage where he's freaking out, throwing the books, yelling that this isn't fair.
That's not fair at all.
But it's more of a distraught and denial of the entire situation, which I think is far more realistic for everything that he's been through. So that's why I have to give it a 93. And for our third category, we have predictability, and whether or not you're able to see this coming from a mile away, or if it's all of a sudden and out of left field. We want to be right in the middle, because a perfect twist is going to be perfectly balanced. And I gotta say, the foreshadowing for this is pretty good in this episode, because the first time I watched it, I never really picked up on the fact that his glasses fell off of his face earlier in the episode, or the different moments throughout the episode where they weren't all the way on his face, where he's reaching over to grab them to put them back on his face. But we do get to see from his perspective a couple times before the ending to see how bad his vision really is. And the thing is, the first time you see Henry, that's the first thing you see, is his glasses. And with him being set up as such an adamant reader,
You, Mr. Bemis, are a reader.
we know that his glasses are really important. And since the twist is not the fact that the H-bomb went off and destroyed everything around him,
He'll have a world all to himself, without anyone.
I'm left with the question of what else would the twist be? And being honest, I feel like the reason that somebody wouldn't pick up on what the twist is going to be in the end is because it's the one thing that you don't want to happen to Henry. This guy with these huge glasses that all he wants to do is read, and whenever he finally has time, they slip from his face, and we're left saying,
That's not fair.
and just because I didn't want it to happen, that's exactly what did happen. That's why I have to give this an 80 on the predictable side. And with category number 4 being satisfaction, it's not so much of how good does this twist make me feel, it's more of a question of how memorable is this payoff to the viewer. It's Not Fair is one of the most memorable scenes in all of television history. And it's so clear from the comments and how many people mention this episode as their favorite twist in the Twilight Zone in the last episode that it's obviously stuck with many of us for a very long time. And if this is your first experience seeing all of this, it's okay. You can cry a little bit along with Mr. Bemis and also say, it's not fair.
That's not fair at all.
So to make it up to Mr. Bemis, I'm going to give it the highest score I've given so far with a 99. And now with our final category, and most important of all because it's my opinion, we have the Poltergeiger. I love this episode, and clearly a bunch of you do too, since it was the most asked for out of the comments on the last episode. And while I would put this in my top 5, it is not my favorite episode of the Twilight Zone. Honestly, it's not even my favorite episode that Burgess Meredith was in. And you'll find out exactly what my favorite episode is of the Twilight Zone in the next video in the series. And down the road, I'll also cover my favorite episode with Burgess Meredith.
I am a human being. You're a librarian.
But watching this one back, I just wanted more time with Mr. Henry Bemis. I just wanted to sit down with him and let him talk about some books, and hopefully that I've read some of the books that he's read, and we can just go back and forth and have a great conversation about literature. But I guess that's just how it goes whenever you have to cram all of this down into like 22 minutes for an episode. So I will say it is always good to leave your audience wanting more. So to Mr. Henry Bemis, I have to give him a 90, bringing our total for Time Enough at Last to a 91.2, which puts it above the last episode that I did.
Where is everybody?
And I guess also making this the greatest twist to ever happen until later episodes in this series.
That's not fair.
And while I already have the next few episodes of this series planned out, I still want to know what you consider is the greatest twist of all time. Because it could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a manga, it could be a graphic novel, it could be an internet short story. There's so many pieces of horror media out there, but we have to find the greatest of all time in this series. And if you did make it this far, do me a favor and hit the colorful like button down there, and subscribe if you're not subscribed to the channel so you can keep up with this series. And of course, I have to thank all of my amazing channel members. You guys directly support me, and I still don't know how to wrap my head around that. Thank you so much. And with all of that being said, I hope that you had a good time. I hope that you have an extra blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one. Whenever. It's just when, not whenever, as the comments have told me 10,000 times.